The letter arrived at midnight, and Eleanor Hartley knew before she opened it that her family's world was about to break apart. Her hands trembled as she read the words written by the physician who had been treating her younger sister for the past month. Clara's fever had not broken. Her lungs were failing. Without a rare medicine that cost more than the Hartley family could earn in 3 years, she would not survive the winter. Eleanor had spent the last 4 weeks sitting beside Clara's bed every night after her own work ended, pressing cool cloths to her sister's forehead, and listening to the rattling sound in her chest grow worse with each passing day. She had prayed. She had bargained with a silence that never answered back, and she had watched her mother grow thinner from worry with every sunrise. Nothing had changed until this letter, and now everything had changed too quickly for her to feel any relief at all. Eleanor sat at the small wooden table in their modest home, the candle burning low, and stared at the numbers on the page until they blurred. Her father had died 2 years earlier, leaving behind debts instead of comfort. Her mother worked long hours sewing gowns for wealthy families who barely noticed her existence. There was no fortune to draw from, no relative willing to lend such a sum, and no time to wait for a miracle. She pressed her palm against her chest, trying to steady her breathing, and made a decision that would change everything. She would go to the one person in the county who had the money to save her sister, even if he was a man everyone feared. The Duke of Ashcombe lived in a grand house at the edge of town, a house people crossed the street to avoid walking past after dark. Stories about him spread through every drawing room and market stall. Some said he had caused the death of his first fiancée. Others whispered that he kept to himself because he could not bear to look at another person without wanting to destroy them. Eleanor had never met him, but she had heard his name spoken in hushed, frightened tones since she was a child. She arrived at his gates the next morning, her cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might give her away. A servant led her through a long corridor lined with portraits of stern ancestors, and she felt smaller with every step. When she finally stood before the Duke in his study, she almost lost her courage entirely. He was younger than she expected, with dark hair and eyes that studied her without any warmth. He did not rise from his chair. He did not offer her a seat. He simply waited for her to speak, as though her presence in his home was an inconvenience he intended to end quickly. The study itself surprised her. She had imagined something cold and bare, matching the stories she had heard. But the room was lined with books from floor to ceiling, and a fire burned steadily in the hearth despite the mild morning outside. It did not feel like the lair of a monster. It felt like the private space of a man who spent most of his hours alone, by choice or by circumstance she could not yet tell. Eleanor forced the words out before her fear could stop her. She explained her sister's illness, the cost of the medicine, and her desperate need for help. She expected him to laugh at her, or worse, to have her removed from his home without another word. Instead, he watched her in silence for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he made an offer that stole the breath from her lungs. He would pay for the medicine, all of it, without condition on the money itself, but he required something in return. He needed a wife, and he needed one within the week. If Eleanor agreed to marry him, her sister would have everything she needed to recover. Eleanor's mind raced through every warning she had ever heard about this man. She thought of the rumors, the whispered accusations, the way people lowered their voices whenever his name came up. But she also thought of Clara's pale face and shallow breathing, and she knew there was no true choice in front of her at all. She asked him why he wanted a wife so suddenly, why a man of his position could not simply choose from the many families who would offer their daughters willingly. His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker behind his eyes, something that looked almost like pain. But he did not explain. He told her only that his reasons were his own, and that she would have his answer soon enough if she accepted. Eleanor thought of her mother, exhausted and frightened, sitting beside Clara's bed through the night. She thought of the years her family had struggled since her father's death, the quiet desperation that had become their constant companion. She looked at the Duke, this man the whole county feared, and she nodded. The arrangements moved faster than she could process. Within 2 days, the physician confirmed that the medicine had been delivered, and that Clara showed the first signs of improvement. Within 5 days, Eleanor stood in a small chapel wearing a borrowed gown, reciting vows to a man she barely knew, in front of a handful of witnesses who seemed as confused by the sudden union as she was. The Duke said his vows in a steady, quiet voice, betraying no emotion at all. Eleanor's voice shook as she spoke hers, and she wondered, even as the words left her mouth, what kind of life she had just agreed to. She did not know if she had saved her sister only to condemn herself. After the ceremony, there was no celebration, no gathering of friends and family to mark the occasion. The Duke simply escorted her to a carriage waiting outside the chapel, helped her inside with careful but distant courtesy, and sat across from her in silence as the horses pulled them away from everything familiar. Eleanor stared out the window as the town disappeared behind them, replaced slowly by open fields and then by the looming shape of Ashcombe Manor rising against the gray sky. The house looked even larger up close, its stone walls dark and unwelcoming, its windows like watching eyes. She thought of every story she had ever heard about the man sitting across from her, and she braced herself for whatever waited behind those doors. Halfway through the journey, she stole a glance at her new husband and found him already watching her, though he looked away the moment their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt heavier than any conversation could have been, filled with questions neither seemed willing to ask. Eleanor wondered if he regretted his offer already, or if silence was simply the way he moved through the world. When the carriage finally stopped, the Duke stepped out first and offered his hand to help her down. She hesitated only a moment before taking it, aware of how cold his fingers felt against hers, aware of how little she truly knew about the life she had just entered. A row of servants stood waiting at the entrance, their faces carefully neutral, though Eleanor caught a few curious glances directed her way. The housekeeper, a stern but not unkind woman named Mrs. Whitfield, stepped forward to greet her. She offered a polite welcome and promised to show Eleanor to her rooms, but her eyes kept flicking toward the Duke as though searching for some signal Eleanor could not see. The Duke gave a small nod, and Mrs. Whitfield led Eleanor inside without another word from him. As Eleanor walked through the vast halls of her new home, she tried to memorize the path, tried to steady the fear still coursing through her chest. She passed room after room, each one grander and colder than the last, until she reached a chamber that would now be hers. It was beautifully furnished, filled with soft light and warm colors, nothing like the harsh reputation of the man who owned this house. Mrs. Whitfield left her alone to settle in, and Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to breathe. She thought of Clara, safe now, recovering in their small home because of the sacrifice she had just made. She thought of her mother's tearful gratitude when she explained what she had done, and she thought of the Duke, standing so still and unreadable in his study, offering help to a stranger without any apparent gain for himself. Nothing about this arrangement made sense to her. A man as feared as he was supposed to be would not have simply given away such a fortune out of kindness. There had to be a reason, something he was not telling her, something hidden beneath the calm surface he presented to the world. That evening, a servant brought a simple meal to her room and informed her that the Duke would not be joining her for dinner. He preferred to dine alone, the servant explained carefully, as though offering an apology on his behalf. Eleanor ate in silence, staring at the closed door, wondering what kind of man hid himself so completely from his own wife on their wedding night. Later, as she lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the wind moving through the old stone walls of Ashcombe Manor, Eleanor made herself a quiet promise. She would learn the truth about the man she had married, no matter how frightening that truth might be. She had entered this marriage to save her sister's life, but now that she was here, she could not simply close her eyes to the mystery surrounding her husband. Somewhere in this house, behind the silence and the rumors, was the real reason the Duke of Ashcombe had chosen her, and Eleanor intended to find it, even if it meant facing whatever darkness had earned him his fearsome name. She closed her eyes at last, exhaustion pulling her towards sleep despite the questions still spinning through her mind. Tomorrow she would begin learning the shape of her new life, the rules of this house, and the truth about the man whose name she now carried. Tonight, she allowed herself only one small comfort. Clara was alive, and breathing easier with each passing hour, and whatever price Eleanor had to pay for that gift, she would find the strength to pay it. A scream tore through the quiet halls of Ashcombe Manor before dawn, and Eleanor bolted upright in bed, her heart slamming against her ribs. She listened, frozen, waiting for it to come again. When only silence answered, she told herself it had been part of a dream, though her hands would not stop shaking as she reached for a candle. She had been in her new home for only 3 days, and already the house felt full of secrets pressing against the walls. She rose and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, stepping into the corridor to see if anyone else had heard the sound. The hallway stretched empty and dark in both directions, the portraits of stern ancestors watching her with painted eyes that seemed to follow her movement. At the end of the hall, she saw a thin line of candlelight beneath a closed door. She approached slowly, her bare feet silent against the cold floor, and paused outside what she now recognized as the Duke's private study. She could hear him inside, his voice low and strained, though she could not make out the words. It did not sound like anger, it sounded like grief. Eleanor stood there longer than she should have, torn between the urge to knock and the fear of what she might find. In the end, she returned to her room without disturbing him, but sleep did not come easily for the rest of that night. She lay awake, turning over every rumor she had heard about her husband, wondering which of them, if any, held some grain of truth. The following morning, she found him at breakfast, seated alone at the long table, a plate of food barely touched in front of him. He looked up when she entered, and for a brief moment something like surprise crossed his face, as though he had not expected her to seek him out. She took the seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. He watched her carefully, his expression guarded, but he did not ask her to leave. Eleanor decided this was as good a chance as any to begin understanding the man she had married. She asked him simple questions at first, about the house, about his daily routine, about the servants who moved through the halls with quiet efficiency. He answered each one briefly, offering no more information than necessary, yet he did not dismiss her either. A servant poured tea into her cup, and Eleanor noticed the way the young woman's hands trembled slightly, not from fear of the Duke, but from the simple nervousness of a new mistress watching her work. Eleanor offered a small smile of thanks, and the servant relaxed visibly, glancing toward the Duke as though checking his reaction. He said nothing, but something in his posture eased as well, as though he approved of the kindness without needing to voice it. When breakfast ended, he rose from the table and informed her, almost as an afterthought, that she was welcome to use the library whenever she wished. It was a small offer, delivered without warmth, yet Eleanor understood it as a kind of gift. A man guarding himself so carefully did not open his home to a stranger without meaning something by it. As the days passed, Eleanor began to notice things that did not match the frightening stories she had grown up hearing. The servants did not flinch when he entered a room. Mrs. Whitfield spoke of him with something close to fondness, mentioning small kindnesses he had shown the staff over the years, help with medical bills, patience with mistakes, quiet generosity that never sought recognition. None of it matched the image of a cruel and dangerous man. Yet he remained distant with her, careful to keep space between them at every meal, every chance meeting in the halls. He gave her freedom to explore the estate as she wished, freedom to write letters to her family, freedom to spend her days however she chose. It was not the controlling, frightening marriage she had braced herself for. If anything, his distance felt less like cruelty and more like a wall he had built around himself long before she arrived. Eleanor began spending her afternoons walking the grounds of Ashcombe Manor, partly to fill the long hours and partly to understand the man whose name she now carried. She found gardens that had once clearly been tended with great care, now slightly overgrown, as though whoever had loved them had stopped visiting years ago. She found a small stone bench beneath a willow tree, worn smooth from years of use, facing a view of the distant hills. Something about the spot felt sorrowful, as though it held memories too heavy for the beauty surrounding it. She asked one of the younger servants about the garden's history, and the girl hesitated before explaining that the Duke's mother had designed it long before she passed, and that the Duke still visited the bench occasionally, always alone, always in silence. Eleanor filed the detail away with the others she was collecting, small pieces of a puzzle she did not yet understand. One afternoon, while wandering through a section of the house she had not yet explored, Eleanor found a locked door at the end of a narrow hallway. Unlike the other rooms, this one showed no dust on its frame, no sign of neglect, suggesting someone visited it regularly despite the lock. She pressed her palm against the wood, curiosity pulling at her, but she did not dare try the handle. Something about the stillness of that hallway made her skin prickle with unease. She asked Mrs. Whitfield about it later, keeping her tone light and casual. The housekeeper's expression shifted immediately, her warmth cooling into something guarded. She explained only that the room belonged to the Duke's private matters, and that Eleanor would do well to leave it be. The clear discomfort in her voice told Eleanor more than any explanation could have. Eleanor did not press further in the moment, but she noticed how quickly Mrs. Whitfield changed the subject afterward, speaking at length about the dinner menu and the arrangements for the coming week, as though eager to steer the conversation somewhere safer. It only deepened Eleanor's certainty that whatever lay behind that door was tied directly to the tragedy everyone refused to discuss openly, and that the household staff had been trained, whether by loyalty or fear, to protect that secret from outsiders, even from the new mistress of the house. That evening a letter arrived for Eleanor, delivered by a messenger who refused to give his name. She opened it in the privacy of her room, expecting perhaps a note from her mother, but the handwriting belonged to a stranger. The message was short and unsigned, warning her that she had married a man capable of great harm, and that she should leave Ashcombe Manor before she became his next victim. Eleanor read the words 3 times, her pulse quickening with each pass. She thought of the locked door, the strange sound she had heard in the night, the careful way Mrs. Whitfield avoided certain topics. Fear crept back into her chest, the same fear she had felt walking into the Duke's study for the first time. She folded the letter and hid it beneath her mattress, unsure whether to confront her husband or simply watch him more closely. She considered asking Mrs. Whitfield who might have sent such a message, but something about the careful, deliberate handwriting told her the answer would not come easily. Whoever had written those words knew enough about her situation to find her within days of her arrival, which meant they were watching the house closely, perhaps even someone connected to the family or the staff. The thought unsettled her far more than the warning itself, and she found herself glancing toward the windows more often than usual for the rest of that evening, half expecting to see a shadow moving beyond the glass. Over the following days, she found herself studying him in a new light, searching for any sign that might confirm the warning in the letter. She watched the way his hands moved when he spoke, steady and controlled. She watched the way his eyes sometimes drifted toward that locked hallway when he thought no one was looking, a flicker of pain crossing his features before he composed himself again. Despite her growing unease, she also began to notice something else, something she had not expected to find in a man so feared by the world outside these walls. He was patient with her questions, even when he chose not to answer them fully. He remembered small details she mentioned only once, ensuring her favorite tea was always prepared, that her room stayed warm through the cold evenings. Small gestures, quiet and unspoken, that did not fit the image of a monster capable of harming his own wife. One evening she worked up the courage to ask him directly about the rumors surrounding his first fiancée. His entire body stiffened at the mention, his jaw tightening in a way she had come to recognize as pain rather than anger. He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and controlled, though she could hear the effort it took him to keep it that way. He told her only that the woman he had once been engaged to had died years earlier, and that the circumstances surrounding her death had never been fully explained to his satisfaction. He offered no further details, no defense against the whispers that named him responsible. Eleanor watched him carefully as he spoke, searching for guilt or deception, but she found only exhaustion, the weariness of a man who had carried an accusation for far too long without any way to prove his innocence. She wanted to ask more, to push past the careful walls he kept around himself, but something in his expression stopped her. Whatever had happened to his fiancée had clearly wounded him deeply, and pressing further felt cruel rather than helpful. Instead, she simply told him she did not believe the worst of the rumors, and watched surprise flicker across his face once again, as though her words meant more to him than she realized. He studied her for a long moment, as though trying to determine whether her words were genuine, or simply polite comfort offered out of duty. Whatever he saw in her expression seemed to satisfy him, because his shoulders relaxed slightly, the tension he carried easing just a fraction. He admitted, quietly, that no one outside his closest household had ever offered him that kind of trust before. The whole county had judged him guilty the moment the rumors began, and he had long since stopped expecting anyone to think otherwise. Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest at his words, a mixture of sympathy and a growing certainty that she had married a man far more wronged than wicked. She thought of the locked room, the grief she had heard through his study door, and wondered how much of his isolation had been chosen freely, and how much had simply been forced upon him by a world too eager to believe the worst. That night, as Eleanor lay in bed replaying the conversation, she found herself questioning everything she thought she understood about her husband. The unsigned letter still sat hidden beneath her mattress, its warning unresolved, but for the first time since arriving at Ashcombe Manor, she wondered if the true danger lay not within these walls, but somewhere outside them, in the hands of whoever had sent that message. She thought of the locked door at the end of the hallway, the grief she had heard through his study door, the careful distance he kept even as small kindnesses slipped through his guarded exterior. Nothing about this man matched the monster the county whispered about, yet something dark clearly haunted him, something tied to that locked room and the fiancé he refused to discuss in full. Eleanor made a quiet decision as sleep finally began to pull her under. She would not run from Ashcombe Manor because of an anonymous warning. Instead, she would find the truth for herself, no matter how carefully her husband tried to keep it hidden. She owed him that much, she realized, for the strange, quiet kindness he had shown her, despite everything the world believed about him. But as her eyes finally closed, one thought lingered longer than the rest, refusing to let her rest completely. If the Duke of Ashcombe was truly innocent, then someone else carried the guilt for whatever tragedy had claimed his fiancée's life. And that person, whoever they were, might now see Eleanor herself as a threat worth eliminating before she uncovered the truth. Somewhere beyond the walls of Ashcombe Manor, someone had already taken notice of her arrival, someone with enough knowledge of the past to send a warning wrapped in fear rather than kindness. Eleanor did not yet know their name or their purpose, but she understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her search for the truth had already begun to draw attention she could not yet control. Glass shattered somewhere below stairs, and Eleanor nearly dropped the book in her hands. She rushed from the library toward the sound, her pulse hammering, only to find a young servant standing frozen over a broken vase, her face pale with fear rather than injury. Eleanor helped her clean the shards, offering quiet reassurance, but the incident left her shaken, in a way that had little to do with broken glass. 2 weeks had passed since her arrival at Ashcombe Manor, and the unsigned warning still sat hidden beneath her mattress, unresolved and increasingly heavy on her mind. She had begun quietly asking questions whenever the opportunity arose, careful never to press too hard, gathering fragments of the past, the way one might collect scattered puzzle pieces without yet seeing the full picture. She learned, through careful conversation with an older servant named Margaret, that the Duke's first fiancée had been a woman called Isabel Hartford, the daughter of a respected family from a neighboring county. The engagement had been celebrated widely, seen as a promising match between two well-regarded families. Then, only months before the wedding, Isabel had been found dead at the base of a cliff near her family's estate, and the county had never fully recovered from the shock of it. Margaret's voice grew quiet as she described the aftermath, the whispers that began almost immediately, questioning why the Duke had been seen arguing with Isabel the evening before her death. No one had ever proven wrongdoing, but the accusation alone had been enough to poison his reputation for years afterward. Margaret insisted, with quiet conviction, that the Duke she had served for over a decade was not capable of such cruelty, but she admitted she did not know the full truth of what happened that night either. Eleanor pressed gently for more details, and Margaret described how the young master had changed after the tragedy, withdrawing from society almost entirely, refusing invitations he once accepted without hesitation, spending long hours alone in his study with the door locked. The staff had learned, over time, never to mention Isabel's name in his presence, watching him retreat further into himself with each passing year. Margaret's eyes grew misty as she spoke, and Eleanor realized the older woman had genuine affection for the man she served, affection that made her defense of him feel far more credible than any rumor Eleanor had heard from strangers in town. Margaret also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Isabel had grown noticeably anxious in the weeks before her death, jumping at sudden noises, glancing over her shoulder during visits to the estate, as though watching for someone. At the time, the household had assumed it was simple wedding nerves. Looking back, Margaret admitted, it seemed like something far more troubling, something none of them had recognized until it was already too late to help her. Eleanor turned the information over in her mind for days, trying to reconcile the frightened whispers of the county with the careful, guarded man she had come to know inside these walls. She thought of the locked door, the grief in his voice through the study walls, the sorrow that clung to the garden bench beneath the willow tree. None of it painted the picture of a murderer. It painted the picture of a man haunted by something he could not control or explain. She decided, finally, that she needed more than servants' memories and second-hand rumors. She needed to see the truth for herself, and she suspected the answers she sought might lie behind that locked door at the end of the narrow hallway. Late one evening, after the household had settled into silence, Eleanor made her way through the dark corridors, a single candle lighting her path, her heart pounding with every careful step. She reached the door and found it locked exactly as before, but this time she noticed something she had missed on her first visit, a small key resting on the ledge above the frame, easily overlooked unless someone knew precisely where to search. She hesitated, torn between respect for her husband's privacy and the desperate need to understand the man she had married. In the end, curiosity and fear for her own safety won out, and she took the key with trembling fingers. The door opened with a soft creak that seemed impossibly loud in the silent hallway. Inside, she found not the sinister chamber she had feared, but a room preserved with careful, painful precision. A woman's belongings lined the shelves, dresses hung in a wardrobe, a portrait rested above a small writing desk, capturing the likeness of a beautiful young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. This, Eleanor understood immediately, was Isabel's room, kept exactly as it had been before her death. Eleanor moved through the space slowly, careful not to disturb anything, overwhelmed by the weight of grief soaked into every object around her. Dust had settled lightly over most surfaces, but certain items showed signs of recent handling. A hairbrush placed just slightly out of line with the others, a shawl draped carefully over the back of a chair as though someone visited this room simply to remember, to sit for a while among the remnants of a life cut short. She understood now why the servant spoke of the Duke's grief with such certainty. This room was not a secret born of guilt. It was a shrine born of love that had never found peace. On the writing desk, she found a stack of letters tied together with faded ribbon, and against her better judgment, she untied them and began to read. The letters were written in Isabel's own hand, addressed to a friend whose name Eleanor did not recognize, describing her excitement for the coming wedding, her love for the Duke, and, in the final letter, her growing fear of another man who had begun pursuing her attention despite her engagement. The name mentioned in that final letter sent a chill through Eleanor's entire body. Lord Edmund Grayson. Isabel wrote of his unwanted advances, his refusal to accept her rejection, and her fear of what he might do if she continued to refuse him. The letter ended abruptly, as though written in haste, and Eleanor realized with growing horror that it had likely been written only days before Isabel's death. She heard footsteps in the hallway before she could process the full weight of what she had found, and she barely had time to slip the letters into the pocket of her dress before the door opened fully. The Duke stood in the entrance, his face pale with shock at finding her inside this room, his eyes moving from her face to the open wardrobe and back again. For a long, tense moment, neither of them spoke. Eleanor braced herself for anger, for the fury the rumors had always promised lurked beneath his controlled exterior. Instead, she watched his shoulders sink, exhaustion and old grief settling over his features like a familiar weight. He asked, quietly, how much she had seen. Eleanor did not lie. She told him about the letters, about Isabel's fear of Lord Grayson, about the suspicion growing in her chest that the truth of that tragic night had never truly been uncovered. She expected him to demand the letters back, to order her from the room, but instead he sank into the chair beside the writing desk, his composure finally breaking under the weight of years spent carrying an accusation he could not disprove. He explained, his voice raw with old pain, that he had loved Isabel deeply, that her death had shattered something in him he had never fully repaired. He had suspected Grayson's involvement for years, had even confronted him privately in the aftermath, but Grayson had powerful friends and a talent for turning suspicion away from himself. Without proof, the Duke's accusations had only fueled further rumors against himself instead, painting him as a jealous man desperate to shift blame, rather than accept his own guilt. He told her that on the night before Isabel's death, they had argued, though not for the reasons the county assumed. Isabel had come to him frightened, trying to explain something about Grayson's behavior toward her, and he, distracted by wedding preparations and blind to the depth of her fear, had not listened as closely as he should have. He had told her they would discuss it properly after the wedding, never imagining there would be no after for them at all. That single failure, the choice to delay a conversation that might have saved her life, had haunted him every day since, heavier even than the accusations the county had leveled against him. Eleanor listened in silence, understanding now the true source of his guilt. It was not the guilt of a murderer, but the guilt of a man who believed he had failed the person he loved most, who had spent years punishing himself for a mistake born of distraction rather than malice. She wanted to tell him he could not have known, that hindsight made villains of moments that had felt ordinary at the time, but she sensed he needed to say these things aloud before he could hear comfort from anyone else. Eleanor felt something break open in her chest, sympathy mixing with a fierce, unexpected anger on his behalf. She had married this man believing him capable of darkness, and instead she found a man who had spent years silently mourning a woman he could not save, unable to clear his own name because the true culprit had covered his tracks too well. She reached for his hand without thinking, offering the only comfort she could in that moment, and felt him go still beneath her touch, as though no one had offered him such simple kindness in a very long time. They sat together in Isabel's room until the candle burned low, Eleanor listening as the Duke finally spoke openly about the woman he had lost, the wedding that never happened, the years of isolation that followed as the county turned against him. She began to understand, more fully than before, why he kept himself so guarded, why kindness from a stranger surprised him so deeply. The world had judged him without evidence, and he had learned to expect nothing better from anyone who crossed his path. Before she left the room that night, Eleanor made him a quiet promise. She would help him find the proof he needed to clear his name once and for all, using the letters she had found and whatever else they could uncover about Lord Grayson's role in Isabel's death. The Duke studied her for a long moment, surprise and something warmer flickering behind his tired eyes, before he finally nodded, accepting her offer with a gratitude he did not know how to fully express. The following days brought a subtle shift in their relationship. The careful distance the Duke had maintained since their wedding began to soften, replaced by quiet conversations over meals, small moments of shared understanding that had not existed before. Eleanor found herself looking forward to these exchanges, surprised by how quickly her fear of him had transformed into something closer to trust, and perhaps, though she was not yet ready to admit it fully, something closer to affection. Then, without warning, a carriage arrived at Ashcombe Manor, carrying an unexpected guest. Eleanor watched from an upstairs window as a tall, elegantly dressed man stepped down and approached the entrance with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. When Mrs. Whitfield announced the visitor's name in a tight, uneasy voice, Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Lord Edmund Grayson had come to Ashcombe Manor, uninvited and unannounced, and something in his confident smile told Eleanor that his visit had nothing to do with courtesy. She thought immediately of Isabel's letters hidden in her room, of the suspicion the Duke had carried for years without proof, and she wondered, with growing dread, whether Grayson somehow already knew that his secret was no longer as safe as he believed. She hurried downstairs to find the Duke standing rigid in the entrance hall, his expression carefully blank in a way Eleanor now recognized as a mask over deep unease. Grayson greeted him with false warmth, his eyes sweeping over Eleanor with open curiosity as introductions were made. He claimed his visit was simply a neighborly courtesy, an opportunity to meet the new Duchess and offer his congratulations on the marriage. But as Grayson's gaze lingered on Eleanor a moment too long, and as his questions grew subtly probing beneath their polite surface, Eleanor understood that this man had not come merely to offer congratulations. He had come to assess a threat, to determine how much the new Duchess of Ashcombe might already know, and how dangerous she might become to secrets he had kept buried for years. He asked, with practiced casualness, how Eleanor found life at Ashcombe Manor, whether she had settled comfortably into her new surroundings, whether she had explored much of the estate's history during her short time there. Each question felt harmless on its surface, yet Eleanor could feel the careful weight behind them, the way his eyes searched her face for any flicker of recognition or unease. She kept her answers light and vague, offering nothing that might betray the letters hidden upstairs, or the conversation she had shared with her husband only days before. Grayson turned his attention to the Duke next, his tone shifting subtly into something that sounded almost like a challenge disguised as friendly conversation. He mentioned, with feigned sympathy, how relieved the county would be to see the Duke finally moving forward after so many years of solitude, as though his marriage to Eleanor was a performance staged for public approval rather than a genuine union. The Duke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, offering only a controlled, measured response that revealed none of the anger Eleanor suspected he was fighting to contain. Eleanor forced a polite smile onto her face, matching his false courtesy with her own, even as her mind raced through everything she now knew. The letters were hidden safely away, but Grayson's presence in this house felt like a storm gathering on the horizon, one that threatened to sweep away the fragile trust she had only just begun building with her husband. She glanced toward the Duke and saw the same wary tension reflected in his eyes, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever peace they had found in Isabel's room, whatever fragile trust had begun growing between them, was about to be tested by the very man responsible for the tragedy that had shaped both their lives. Eleanor squared her shoulders and prepared herself for whatever battle Lord Grayson intended to bring into their home. A hand closed around Eleanor's wrist the moment she stepped alone into the garden, and she spun around with a gasp, her heart lurching into her throat. Lord Grayson stood before her, his polite smile from the entrance hall replaced now by something colder, something far more calculating. He released her wrist quickly, offering a shallow apology for startling her, though his eyes held no real remorse at all. He had waited, he explained, for a moment, when she would be alone, and Eleanor understood immediately that whatever he intended to say was not meant for the Duke's ears. Her mind raced back to the letters hidden in her room, to Isabel's warnings about this very man, and she forced herself to remain calm despite the fear curling tight in her chest. She glanced toward the house, calculating the distance back to the safety of other people, but Grayson positioned himself casually in a way that blocked her easiest path without appearing threatening to anyone who might glance out a window. It was a subtle move, practiced and deliberate, and it told Eleanor more about the kind of man she faced than any rumor ever could. This was not a man who acted from sudden passion or momentary anger. This was a man who planned carefully, who controlled every situation before he entered it. Grayson wasted no time on further pleasantries. He told her, with chilling directness, that he knew exactly what rumors had followed her husband for years, and that he had been the one responsible for keeping those rumors alive in the years since Isabel's death. He said it not with shame but with a kind of pride, as though the manipulation of an entire county's opinion was an achievement rather than a cruelty. Eleanor's stomach turned, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She asked him plainly why he would confess such a thing to her, a near stranger with every reason to despise him for what he had done. His smile widened, and he explained that he needed her help, that her position as the new Duchess gave her access and influence he could use to finally destroy the reputation the Duke had somehow managed to preserve despite everything. He claimed the Duke still possessed old letters and documents that could implicate Grayson in matters far more serious than rumor, records he needed retrieved and destroyed before they surfaced publicly. In exchange, he offered something Eleanor had not expected, a promise to ensure Clara's continued health, hinting darkly that the physician treating her sister answered to interests Grayson could influence just as easily as he had influenced the county's opinion of the Duke. The threat, however veiled, was unmistakable. Eleanor felt anger rise hot beneath her fear, a fierce protectiveness for her sister mixing with disgust at the man standing before her. She thought of Isabel's final letter, of the fear she had described in her own handwriting before her death, and she understood now, with sickening clarity, exactly what kind of man Grayson truly was, and exactly what he had likely done to silence a woman who refused his advances. She kept her voice steady as she refused him, telling him plainly that she would not betray her husband, and that threatening her sister's life would not earn him the loyalty he sought. Grayson's expression darkened, the false charm slipping away entirely, replaced by something colder and more dangerous. He warned her that she was making a mistake, that the Duke's downfall was coming regardless of her choice, and that she would only suffer alongside him if she continued to stand in his way. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to something almost gentle, almost persuasive, as though he believed reason alone might still win her over where threats had failed. He spoke of the life he could offer her instead, the protection and comfort that came with aligning herself with a man of his influence, rather than one already drowning beneath years of public suspicion. Eleanor felt disgust curl through her at the suggestion, understanding now that Grayson saw people as pieces to be maneuvered, loyalty as something that could always be purchased given the right price. She told him firmly that nothing he offered could ever tempt her, and she watched his patience finally break, his expression twisting into something that confirmed every fear Isabel had written in her final letter. He left her standing alone in the garden, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and fury, the weight of his threats settling heavily over her shoulders. She hurried back into the house, desperate to find the Duke and warn him of what had just occurred. But as she moved through the halls, she realized she would need to choose her words carefully. Telling him everything Grayson had confessed would mean revealing that she had read Isabel's private letters, a secret she had kept close since the night she found them. She found the Duke in his study, and the moment he saw her expression, he rose from his chair with visible concern, crossing the room to stand before her. She told him everything, the confrontation in the garden, Grayson's confession, the veiled threat against Clara's safety. His face grew pale with barely controlled anger as she spoke, his hands clenching at his sides, though he never once raised his voice or frightened her with his fury. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, processing the confirmation of suspicions he had carried for years without proof. Grayson had finally shown his hand, admitting to manipulations he had always denied publicly, and though his confession had been made privately, with no witnesses to corroborate Eleanor's account, it represented the first real crack in the armor he had maintained for so long. The Duke assured Eleanor immediately that Clara's safety was not truly at Grayson's mercy, that the physician treating her sister had no connection to the man's influence, and that the threat had likely been an empty attempt at manipulation rather than a genuine danger. Still, he promised to send additional protection to the Hartley household as a precaution, unwilling to risk Eleanor's family over even the smallest possibility that Grayson's reach extended further than he claimed. Eleanor felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders at his reassurance, though the fear Grayson had planted did not fully disappear. She asked the Duke what they should do now that Grayson had revealed his intentions so clearly, and he explained that they needed more than her testimony alone. They needed physical proof, something undeniable that could expose Grayson's role in Isabel's death and clear the Duke's name once and for all, before Grayson found a way to twist this confrontation into another weapon against them. Together, they returned to Isabel's room that evening, searching more thoroughly than Eleanor had dared to on her own. Behind a loose panel in the writing desk, they found a small hidden compartment containing additional documents, records of payments made to servants who had since left the county, payments that appeared designed to secure their silence about something witnessed the night before Isabel's death. It was not conclusive proof of murder, but it was enough to suggest a cover-up far more extensive than a single argument between rivals. The Duke's hands shook slightly as he examined the documents, years of buried suspicion finally finding tangible support. Eleanor watched him carefully, understanding the weight of what they had found. The possibility that after years of silent grief and public shame, he might finally have a path toward clearing his name and honoring Isabel's memory properly. He read each name listed in the payment records aloud, and Eleanor watched recognition flicker across his face as he recalled the servants who had once worked at Isabel's family estate, several of whom had left their positions abruptly in the months following her death, never to be seen in the county again. At the time, their sudden departures had seemed unremarkable, easily explained by grief or a desire for fresh surroundings. Now, viewed through the lens of Grayson's hidden payments, those departures looked like something far more deliberate, a careful effort to remove anyone who might have witnessed something inconvenient on the night Isabel died. They spent the following days working quietly to locate the servants named in the documents, hoping to find someone willing to speak the truth after so many years of silence. It was delicate, dangerous work, conducted carefully to avoid drawing Grayson's attention before they had gathered enough evidence to act. Eleanor found herself growing closer to the Duke through the shared purpose, their conversations no longer limited to careful politeness, but filled instead with genuine partnership, trust building steadily between them with each passing day. One evening, as they reviewed the documents together in his study, the Duke reached for her hand across the desk, a small, uncertain gesture that surprised them both. He told her, quietly, that he had not expected to find comfort or partnership in this marriage, that he had entered their arrangement expecting only isolation to continue as it always had. Eleanor felt her heart quicken at his words, understanding that something had shifted between them beyond the shared mission to expose Grayson's guilt. She admitted, in turn, that she had come to Ashcombe Manor braced for cruelty, prepared to endure whatever hardship her sister's survival demanded of her. Instead, she had found a man who listened carefully, who remembered small kindnesses, who carried his grief with a dignity that had nothing to do with the monster the county had invented in his place. The candlelight flickered between them as they spoke, the documents momentarily forgotten, and for the first time since her arrival, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine a future in this marriage that extended beyond mere survival and obligation. But their fragile progress was interrupted abruptly when a servant rushed into the study, breathless and pale, reporting that one of the former household staff they had been quietly seeking, a man who might hold crucial testimony about the night of Isabel's death, had been found dead that very morning, the circumstances of his passing already being labeled a tragic accident by local authorities. Eleanor felt cold dread settle over her as the Duke's expression hardened into something she had not seen from him before, controlled fury replacing the warmth of moments earlier. The timing was too precise, too convenient to be mere coincidence. Grayson had learned of their investigation, and he had moved to silence a witness before they could reach him, proving beyond doubt that he was willing to protect his secrets by any means necessary. The Duke questioned the servant carefully, learning that the man had been found near a river crossing on his own property, the local magistrate already satisfied with an explanation of a slip on wet stones. No one seemed inclined to look further. No one except the two people standing in this study who understood exactly how convenient such an accident had become. Eleanor thought of Isabel, found at the base of a cliff years earlier, another death too easily explained away by those unwilling to ask harder questions, and she felt a fresh wave of grief for a woman she had never known but had come to understand through her letters. The Duke moved to the window, staring out at the darkening grounds with his hands clasped tightly behind his back, and Eleanor recognized the posture of a man forcing himself to remain calm when every instinct urged him toward action. She crossed the room to stand beside him, offering silent support rather than empty words, and after a long moment, he turned to her with a resolve she had not seen in him before. Whatever caution had guided their investigation until now would have to sharpen considerably, he told her, because Grayson had shown them exactly how far he was willing to go to protect himself. The fragile safety Eleanor had begun to feel within Ashcombe Manor shattered in that instant, replaced by the stark understanding that Grayson considered them both threats worth eliminating. Whatever peace they had found together, whatever trust had begun to blossom between them, would now have to withstand a far more dangerous confrontation than either of them had anticipated when this investigation began. Hooves pounded against the gravel path outside Ashcombe Manor at first light, and Eleanor woke to the sound of urgent voices echoing through the halls below. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs, finding the Duke already in the entrance hall, speaking in low, tense tones with a messenger who had ridden through the night to deliver news that could not wait for a proper hour. The messenger explained, breathless and anxious, that a formal complaint had been filed against the Duke with the county magistrate, accusing him of tampering with evidence related to Isabel's death years earlier. The complaint included documents, forged though neither Eleanor nor the Duke yet knew it, suggesting he had bribed witnesses and falsified records to protect himself from prosecution. It was, unmistakably, Grayson's counterattack, launched the moment he suspected his own secrets were at risk of exposure. Mrs. Whitfield appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the commotion, and her face fell the moment she understood what was happening. She had served this family long enough to remember the first wave of suspicion that had followed Isabel's death, the way it had nearly destroyed the household even without formal charges attached. To see it returning now, sharper and more deliberate, filled her with a visible dread that mirrored Eleanor's own rising fear. She moved quickly to gather the remaining household staff, instructing them quietly to prepare for whatever difficult days lay ahead. Eleanor felt panic rise in her chest as the Duke read through the summons the messenger had brought, his face growing paler with each line. If the magistrate believed even a fraction of these accusations, the Duke could face imprisonment, his title and estate stripped away, his name destroyed beyond any hope of recovery. Grayson had moved quickly and ruthlessly, turning the very investigation meant to expose him into a weapon against the man he had wronged for years. The Duke set the summons down with hands that trembled only slightly, years of practiced control keeping his composure intact even as the walls seemed to close in around him. He explained to Eleanor that they had only days before he would be required to appear before the magistrate, and that Grayson's influence within the county court system meant the proceedings were unlikely to favor them without overwhelming proof of his innocence. Eleanor refused to accept defeat so easily. She reminded him of the letters, the hidden payment records, the pattern of servants who had vanished after Isabel's death, all evidence that painted a very different picture from the one Grayson had constructed. It would not be enough, the Duke warned her gently. Not against forged documents bearing his own signature and the testimony of witnesses Grayson had likely paid to lie under oath. They needed something undeniable, something that could not be dismissed as coincidence or circumstantial suspicion. They spent the following days working with an intensity that left little room for rest, poring over every piece of evidence they had gathered, searching for any thread that might lead them closer to definitive proof. Eleanor suggested locating the servants who had left the county after receiving Grayson's payments, reasoning that even years later, guilt or fear might have loosened their tongues if approached with the right combination of assurance and pressure. Through careful inquiry and the help of a few trusted contacts the Duke maintained despite his isolation, they located one former servant living in a neighboring town under a different name. The journey to reach her took the better part of a day, the carriage winding through unfamiliar roads while Eleanor rehearsed carefully what she might say to convince a frightened stranger to revisit the most painful chapter of her past. The Duke remained quiet for much of the ride, his thoughts clearly consumed by the weight of what tomorrow's hearing might bring regardless of what they found today. The woman, clearly frightened by their sudden appearance, initially denied any knowledge of the events surrounding Isabel's death. But when Eleanor spoke gently of Isabel's final letter, of her fear and her hope for a happy future stolen from her, something in the woman's resolve finally broke. She confessed, through tears, that she had witnessed Grayson following Isabel toward the cliff path on the night of her death, had heard raised voices carried on the wind, though she had been too far away and too frightened to intervene or fully understand what she witnessed. When Isabel's body was discovered the following morning, Grayson had approached her privately, offering a substantial sum of money in exchange for her silence about what she had seen, along with a clear threat about what might happen to her family if she chose to speak instead. The woman described the years that followed, the guilt that had never truly faded despite the distance she had put between herself and the county, the nightmares that still visited her whenever she closed her eyes on quiet nights. She had told herself for years that her silence had been necessary, that speaking up would only have brought danger to her own family without changing the outcome for Isabel, who was already gone. Meeting Eleanor, hearing the genuine grief and determination in her voice, had finally given her the courage to consider that perhaps it was not too late to do what she should have done years earlier. The woman agreed, finally, after years of guilt and silence, to provide a written statement detailing what she had witnessed, along with her willingness to testify before the magistrate if necessary. It was not an eyewitness account of murder itself, but it was enough to establish Grayson's presence at the scene and his subsequent effort to bribe a witness into silence, evidence that directly contradicted the innocent narrative he had maintained for years. Eleanor and the Duke returned to Ashcombe Manor with the signed statement carefully secured, cautious optimism beginning to replace the desperation that had gripped them since the summons arrived. But their relief proved short-lived. That same evening, a fire broke out in the estate's records room, destroying several important documents before the household staff managed to bring the flames under control. The Duke's face turned grim as he surveyed the damage, certain that Grayson's reach had extended even into his own home. Fortunately, the most critical evidence, including the servant's signed statement and Isabel's original letters, had been kept secured in Eleanor's private chambers rather than the records room, spared from the deliberate destruction that had claimed lesser documents. Still, the fire served as a clear and frightening message, proof that Grayson would stop at nothing to prevent the truth from surfacing, even resorting to endangering the entire household in his desperation to protect himself. Security around the estate tightened considerably in the days that followed, the Duke bringing in trusted men to guard the grounds against further intrusion. Eleanor found herself unable to fully relax, constantly aware of shadows moving beyond windows, of footsteps in hallways that might belong to friend or enemy alike. The strain began to show on both of them, exhaustion and fear wearing down the fragile peace they had built together in recent weeks. Mrs. Whitfield insisted on personally overseeing the safekeeping of the most crucial documents from that point forward, moving them into a small strongbox that never left her sight during daylight hours and remained locked in Eleanor's chambers through the night. The older woman's quiet determination reminded Eleanor of how deeply this household had suffered under years of suspicion and fear, and how desperately everyone within these walls hoped for the chance to finally see the truth brought into the light. On the night before the Duke was scheduled to appear before the magistrate, Eleanor could not sleep. She found him in his study, reviewing their evidence one final time, his expression heavy with the weight of what tomorrow might bring. She sat beside him, and for a long while, neither of them spoke, simply drawing quiet comfort from each other's presence as the candle burned low between them. He finally broke the silence, telling her that regardless of what happened tomorrow, he wanted her to know how deeply grateful he was for everything she had done, for believing in his innocence when the entire county had condemned him without question, for standing beside him through danger she had never asked to face. Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes as she listened, understanding that whatever had begun as a desperate bargain to save her sister had transformed into something far deeper, a genuine partnership built on trust and shared purpose. She told him, her voice steady despite the fear lingering beneath her words, that she believed in him completely, that whatever the magistrate decided tomorrow, she would stand beside him without hesitation or regret. He reached for her hand, and this time neither of them pulled away, the careful distance that had once defined their marriage finally dissolving into something warmer, something that felt, for the first time, like the beginning of a genuine love rather than a transaction born of desperation. The morning of the hearing arrived too quickly, gray clouds gathering over Ashcombe Manor as though mirroring the tension inside its walls. Eleanor dressed carefully, gathering the evidence they had assembled into a single leather case, her hands steady despite the anxiety twisting through her stomach. The Duke waited for her in the entrance hall, dressed formally, his expression composed into the careful mask he wore before the world, though Eleanor could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. They traveled together to the county courthouse, a modest stone building filled already with curious onlookers eager to witness the spectacle of the feared Duke finally facing justice for a crime the county had long suspected him of committing. Eleanor felt their stares as she walked beside her husband into the building, whispers following their every step, but she kept her chin high and her expression steady, refusing to let fear show on her face. She recognized faces from the town among the crowd, people who had once looked at her with pity when she agreed to marry a man they believed capable of terrible things. Their expressions now held a mixture of curiosity and cautious reassessment, as though the very fact that she stood beside him so calmly had begun to plant seeds of doubt about the rumors they had accepted so readily for years. Eleanor drew strength from that small shift, understanding that today's proceedings would shape not only the Duke's legal fate, but the way this entire county remembered him for years to come. Lord Grayson arrived shortly after them, dressed in fine clothing and wearing an expression of practiced concern, as though he mourned the necessity of bringing such serious accusations against a neighbor he claimed to respect. Eleanor watched him greet the magistrate with easy familiarity, a reminder of exactly how deep his influence extended within this county, and she felt a fresh wave of determination settle over her fear. This man had manipulated the truth for years, had destroyed lives and reputations to protect himself, and today, finally, they had the chance to end his deception once and for all. The hearing began with the formal reading of the charges against the Duke, the forged documents presented as evidence of his supposed guilt in tampering with the original investigation into Isabel's death. Eleanor watched the magistrate's expression carefully, searching for any sign of bias or predetermined judgment, uncertain whether justice or influence would prevail within these walls. Beside her, the Duke remained perfectly still, his composure a shield against the weight of accusations being read aloud before the gathered crowd. When the moment finally came for their defense to be presented, Eleanor felt her heart pounding as the Duke's chosen advocate rose to address the court, carrying the leather case containing everything they had gathered. The eyes of the entire room turned toward them, and Eleanor understood, with startling clarity, that the truth they carried within that simple case held the power to finally unravel years of lies, or to be dismissed entirely by a system Grayson had spent years learning to manipulate in his favor. A gasp swept through the courtroom the moment the advocate opened the leather case, and Eleanor felt every eye in the room shift toward her and the Duke as the first document was presented to the magistrate. The signed statement from the former servant was read aloud in full, describing Grayson's presence on the cliff path the night of Isabel's death, and the payment he had offered to secure her silence in the years that followed. Grayson's composed expression cracked for just a moment, a flicker of alarm crossing his face before he forced his features back into practiced calm. He rose immediately to object, claiming the statement had been coerced or fabricated, that a frightened woman living under an assumed name could hardly be considered a reliable witness after so many years of silence. The magistrate listened carefully, his expression unreadable, and called the woman forward to testify in person, having been brought to the courthouse under careful protection that morning. The woman's voice trembled as she stood before the crowded room, but she did not waver in her testimony, repeating the same account she had given Eleanor days earlier with steady, unflinching detail. She described the raised voices she had heard near the cliff path, the fear that had kept her from investigating further at the time, and the money Grayson had pressed into her hands the following morning along with a warning she had carried in her heart for years. When she finished, a heavy silence settled over the courtroom, broken only by Grayson's sharp intake of breath. Eleanor watched the faces of the gathered crowd shift as the testimony unfolded, disbelief giving way slowly to horrified understanding. Several older residents who had known Isabel personally pressed handkerchiefs to their eyes, mourning anew a young woman whose death had been shrouded in false suspicion for far too long. The magistrate allowed the weight of the testimony to settle before continuing, his expression grave as he made careful notes for the official record. The Duke's advocate presented the hidden payment records next, documents recovered from Isabel's writing desk that listed payments made to several other servants around the same time, all of whom had left the county abruptly in the months following her death. The pattern was undeniable once laid out clearly before the court, a systematic effort to silence anyone who might have witnessed something incriminating on the night of the tragedy. Grayson attempted to argue that the payments were unrelated, generous gifts offered out of grief and generosity, rather than bribes meant to ensure silence, but his explanations grew increasingly strained under the magistrate's pointed questions. Eleanor watched the confidence that had carried him through the county for years begin to crumble, piece by piece, as the weight of evidence mounted against him. Then came the moment Eleanor had been waiting for since the fire in the records room. The Duke's advocate revealed that an investigation into the forged documents used to charge the Duke had traced their creation to a scribe known to work exclusively for Lord Grayson, a detail uncovered through careful inquiry in the days following the fire, when the Duke had quietly hired investigators to trace the origin of the false evidence brought against him. The scribe, when located and questioned under the magistrate's authority, confirmed that Grayson had commissioned the forged documents personally, providing detailed instructions on how to replicate the Duke's signature and fabricate records suggesting witness tampering. Faced with the threat of his own prosecution for forgery, the scribe offered full cooperation, providing written confirmation of Grayson's involvement that left little room for doubt. He described in careful detail the meetings held in secret over the preceding weeks, the payment he had received to ensure the forgeries appeared convincing enough to withstand scrutiny, and the urgency Grayson had expressed in wanting the charges filed quickly, before the Duke could gather any evidence of his own. Each detail the scribe offered aligned precisely with the timeline Eleanor and the Duke had already pieced together, lending further credibility to everything that had been presented before the court that day. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as the full scope of Grayson's deception became clear, years of carefully constructed lies collapsing within the span of a single hearing. Eleanor watched the man who had once cornered her in the garden, who had threatened her sister's safety and orchestrated a witness's death, finally facing consequences he had evaded for far too long. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet relief that the truth had finally found its way into the light. The magistrate called for a brief recess to review the evidence more thoroughly, and Eleanor found herself standing beside the Duke in a small antechamber, both of them silent as the weight of the morning settled over them. He turned to her finally, his eyes filled with an emotion she had not seen from him before, something raw and grateful that went beyond simple relief at the turning tide of the hearing. He told her, quietly, that none of this would have been possible without her courage, her willingness to search for truth even when it meant risking her own safety, her refusal to accept easy answers or convenient rumors. Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes as she listened, understanding that the man before her had spent years believing he deserved the isolation the county had forced upon him, and that her presence in his life had begun to convince him otherwise. She reminded him gently that the courage had not been hers alone, that his willingness to trust her with the truth, to allow her into Isabel's room and the grief he had guarded so carefully for years, had made everything that followed possible. Neither of them, she said, could have unraveled Grayson's deception without the other, and whatever the magistrate decided in the coming minutes, she wanted him to know that the partnership they had built together already felt like the greatest victory of this entire ordeal. When the hearing resumed, the magistrate delivered his judgment with careful, measured words. The charges against the Duke were dismissed entirely, the forged documents recognized for the fabrication they truly were. In their place, new charges were brought against Lord Grayson, encompassing years of manipulation, the bribery of witnesses, the forgery of legal documents, and suspicion of far more serious involvement in Isabel's death that would require further investigation to fully resolve. The magistrate addressed the courtroom directly, before concluding the proceedings, acknowledging publicly that the county had failed the Duke for years, allowing rumor and suspicion to stand unchallenged in place of proper investigation. It was a rare admission from a man of his position, and Eleanor watched the words settle over the crowd, visible shame crossing many faces as they recognized their own role in perpetuating a story that had never been true. Grayson was led from the courtroom under guard, his composed mask finally abandoned entirely, replaced by furious denials that seemed to convince no one who remained to hear them. Eleanor watched him go, feeling the last threads of fear he had planted within her finally begin to loosen their grip. Whatever danger he had posed to her family, to her husband, to the truth itself, had finally been brought into the open where it could no longer hide behind wealth and influence. The crowd that had gathered to witness the Duke's supposed downfall now buzzed with a very different kind of conversation, whispers of astonishment replacing the eager anticipation of scandal they had arrived with that morning. Eleanor caught fragments of conversation as they made their way toward the exit, county residents reassessing years of assumptions they had held about the man they had condemned without ever truly knowing him. Outside the courthouse, the gray clouds that had gathered that morning finally broke apart, sunlight spilling across the stone steps as Eleanor and the Duke emerged together into the open air. He turned to her, and for the first time since their rushed wedding, she saw him smile fully, an expression that transformed his entire face, softening the guarded weariness he had carried for so many years. They returned to Ashcombe Manor that evening, to find the household staff waiting to celebrate, relief and joy evident on every face after years of watching their master carry an unjust burden. Mrs. Whitfield embraced Eleanor without hesitation, tears streaming freely down her weathered cheeks as she expressed gratitude that finally, after so long, the truth had prevailed and justice had found its way to their door. The kitchen staff prepared a modest but heartfelt feast that evening, and for the first time since Eleanor's arrival, the dining hall filled with genuine laughter and easy conversation, the careful formality that had once governed every meal replaced by warmth that reflected the household's collective relief. Margaret, the older servant who had first shared fragments of Isabel's story with Eleanor, raised a quiet toast to the memory of the woman whose truth had finally been honored after so many years of silence. That night, Eleanor and the Duke walked together through the gardens beneath a clear sky filled with stars, pausing beneath the willow tree where his mother's memory still lingered, where his grief for Isabel had once found its only outlet. He spoke openly now of the future, of hopes he had not allowed himself to consider in years, of a life built not on obligation or rumor, but on genuine partnership and growing affection. Eleanor felt her heart swell as she listened, recognizing how far they had traveled together since that frightened morning when she first walked into his study, desperate and afraid, expecting to face a monster and finding instead a man wounded by circumstances beyond his control. She reached for his hand beneath the starlit sky, and this time there was no hesitation in the gesture, no careful distance maintained between them. He turned to face her fully, his expression earnest and open in a way she had never witnessed before, and he told her that what began as a bargain to save her sister had become, for him, the truest gift he had ever received. He asked, quietly, if she might consider staying by his side, not out of obligation or gratitude, but because she wished to build a genuine life together, a marriage founded on the trust and love that had grown between them despite everything working against it. Eleanor answered him without hesitation, her voice steady with a certainty that surprised even herself. telling him that she had already made that choice in her heart long before he asked, somewhere between the letters they had read together and the dangers they had faced side by side. He drew her closer, and beneath the ancient willow tree that had witnessed his family's sorrows for generations, they shared a moment of quiet, genuine happiness neither of them had believed possible when this journey first began. News of Grayson's conviction spread quickly through the county in the weeks that followed, along with a fuller account of the truth behind Isabel's death, painting a clearer picture of the tragedy that had haunted the Duke for so many years. The whispers that had once painted him as dangerous transformed slowly into stories of resilience and quiet dignity, a man who had endured false accusation with grace and finally emerged vindicated through patience and unwavering integrity. Clara's recovery continued steadily throughout this period, and Eleanor made regular visits to her family, bringing news of her new life and watching her mother's worry finally ease into genuine happiness for her daughter's unexpected fortune. What had begun as a desperate sacrifice to save her sister's life had transformed, through courage and shared struggle, into a partnership neither Eleanor nor the Duke could have imagined possible on the day they first exchanged their hurried vows. As autumn settled over Ashcombe Manor, bringing with it golden light and the promise of new beginnings, Eleanor stood once more in the garden beneath the willow tree, watching her husband approach with the easy warmth that had replaced his careful distance entirely. Whatever fear or rumor had once surrounded this house and the man who called it home, it belonged now firmly to the past, replaced by a future built on truth, courage, and a love that had grown stronger through every trial they had faced together. A carriage rolled up the drive of Ashcombe Manor exactly 1 year after Eleanor first arrived as a frightened bride, and this time she stepped out not with fear in her chest, but with a quiet, settled joy that had taken root slowly over months of shared life with the man she now loved without reservation. Clara ran across the gravel to greet her, fully recovered and glowing with health, her laughter ringing bright across the grounds that had once felt so cold and forbidding to Eleanor on her first arrival. The trial of Lord Grayson had concluded some months earlier, the full extent of his crimes finally laid bare before the county he had manipulated for so long. Further investigation, prompted by the courage of the servant who had come forward, uncovered additional evidence confirming his direct role in Isabel's death, evidence that had remained hidden for years beneath layers of bribery and careful deception. Grayson was found guilty on every charge brought against him, stripped of his title, and sentenced to spend the remainder of his years imprisoned for the harm he had caused. The county, once so quick to whisper cruel rumors about the Duke, now spoke of him with genuine respect, admiring the quiet strength he had shown throughout years of false accusation and the grace with which he had finally reclaimed his name. Invitations to social gatherings, once withheld out of fear and suspicion, now arrived regularly at Ashcombe Manor, though the Duke and Eleanor accepted them selectively, preferring the quiet companionship of their own household to the performative gatherings of society. Eleanor's mother visited often in those months, marveling at the transformation in her daughter, the confidence and happiness that radiated from her in a way that had never been possible during their years of struggle and quiet desperation. She watched Eleanor move through Ashcombe Manor not as a reluctant bride bound by obligation, but as its true mistress, beloved by the staff and cherished by her husband in equal measure. The willow tree in the garden became a favorite gathering place for the small family that had formed around Eleanor and the Duke. Clara often found reading beneath its branches during her visits, the same bench that had once held only sorrow now witnessing laughter and quiet contentment instead. The Duke had commissioned a small addition to the garden, a modest memorial stone honoring Isabel's memory, a place where her story could finally be remembered with the truth and dignity she had always deserved, rather than the whispered rumors that had followed her death for so long. Eleanor often found her husband there in quiet moments, standing before the memorial with an expression of peace rather than the haunted grief that had once defined him. He told her on one such evening that he no longer felt the weight of guilt he had carried for years, that finding justice for Isabel had finally allowed him to release the burden of blame he had placed upon himself since her death. He credited Eleanor entirely with that transformation, insisting that her courage and unwavering belief in his innocence had given him the strength to pursue truth he had long ago given up hoping to find. Their marriage, born from desperate circumstance, had grown into something neither of them could have imagined on the day they exchanged hurried vows in a small, quiet chapel. Eleanor often thought back to that frightened young woman who had walked into the Duke's study expecting to face a monster, and she marveled at how completely her understanding of him had transformed through months of shared struggle and growing trust. The household staff, who had once moved carefully around their master's guarded silence, now found him engaged and present in ways they had not witnessed in years. Mrs. Whitfield remarked often, with quiet satisfaction, that the manor itself seemed to have changed since Eleanor's arrival, the cold formality that had once defined its halls replaced by warmth and genuine life. Servants who had once tiptoed nervously through their duties now moved with confidence and ease, secure in a household finally free from the shadow of suspicion that had hung over it for so long. Even the gardens themselves seemed to flourish under the change. The overgrown paths Eleanor had first wandered through, slowly restored to their former beauty, new flowers planted alongside the old ones his mother had once tended with such care. The Duke often joined the gardeners himself on quiet afternoons, finding in the simple work a peace he had not allowed himself to feel in years, Eleanor sometimes sitting nearby with a book, content simply to share the same quiet space with the man who had become her closest companion. As the seasons turned and autumn once again painted the grounds of Ashcombe Manor in shades of gold and amber, Eleanor discovered she was carrying a child, news that filled the household with fresh joy after years of sorrow and uncertainty. The Duke's reaction, when she told him, revealed an emotion so raw and overwhelming that Eleanor understood, in that single moment, just how deeply he had come to cherish the family they were building together, a family built on truth, rather than the fear and rumor that had once defined his name. Clara, now fully grown into her health and strength, became a frequent presence at Ashcombe Manor as the months passed, forming a close bond with the Duke that surprised them both, given how their unlikely connection had begun. He treated her with the same quiet patience and care he showed Eleanor, and Clara, in turn, came to see him not as the feared figure the county had once whispered about, but as the brother she had never had, a steady presence who had ultimately saved not only her life through his initial generosity, but her sister's happiness through the love that grew between them. He taught Clara to ride during her longer visits, patiently guiding her through the same gentle paths where Eleanor had once walked alone, wrestling with fear and uncertainty about the man she had married. Watching them together, laughter carrying across the fields on quiet afternoons, Eleanor often felt her heart swell with gratitude for how completely their circumstances had transformed since that desperate midnight letter had first arrived at her family's door. Eleanor's mother, watching her daughters flourish under circumstances that had once seemed so dire, often remarked that fate had a strange way of turning desperation into blessing, of transforming a frightening bargain into the foundation for genuine happiness neither of them could have predicted. She had feared, on the day Eleanor first left for Ashcombe Manor, that she was sending her daughter into a dangerous unknown. Instead, she had witnessed her build a life filled with more love and security than she had ever dared hope for during their years of hardship. The truth about Isabel's death, once fully understood and acknowledged by the county, brought a measure of peace not only to the Duke, but to Isabel's own family, who had spent years grieving without answers, forced to endure whispered speculation about their daughter's final moments. They visited Ashcombe Manor once, quietly, to see the memorial the Duke had commissioned, and left with quiet gratitude for the man who had finally uncovered the truth their daughter deserved, even after so many years of silence. Eleanor often reflected, in quiet moments during her pregnancy, on the strange path that had led her to this life, the desperate letter that had arrived at midnight, the frightening walk into a feared stranger's study, the rushed vows spoken without any understanding of the man beside her. She could not have imagined, on that first difficult day, the genuine love and partnership that awaited her within the walls of Ashcombe Manor, hidden beneath rumor and grief, until patience and courage revealed the truth beneath. The Duke, for his part, often told Eleanor that meeting her had been the truest turning point of his life, more significant even than the justice finally delivered against Grayson. He had expected, when he made his offer to save Clara's life, to gain nothing more than a convenient arrangement to satisfy an obligation he had never fully explained even to himself. Instead, he had found a partner whose courage matched her compassion, whose refusal to accept easy rumors had ultimately saved not only his reputation, but his capacity to trust and love again after years of isolation. As winter approached once more, bringing with it the anticipation of their child's arrival, Eleanor stood in the nursery being prepared within Ashcombe Manor, watching sunlight stream through windows that had once felt so cold and unwelcoming during her first days in this house. She thought of Isabel, whose memory now rested peacefully beneath the willow tree, whose truth had finally been honored after years of injustice. She thought of Clara, thriving and happy, and of her mother, finally free from the desperate worry that had defined so many years of their lives. Most of all, she thought of the man who had once been the most feared figure in the entire county, a reputation built entirely on lies and manipulation rather than any truth about his character. She had married him to save her sister's life, expecting cruelty and isolation in return. Instead, she had found a partner whose quiet strength and genuine goodness had reshaped her entire understanding of love, patience, and the courage required to seek truth even when the whole world insists otherwise. Ashcombe Manor, once whispered about with fear throughout the county, had become instead a home filled with laughter, love, and the quiet contentment of a family finally free from the shadows that had haunted it for so many years. Eleanor placed a gentle hand over the gentle swell of her growing child, and as her husband entered the nursery to join her, his expression soft with the same quiet joy that had come to define their life together, she understood, with complete certainty, that every fear she had carried on her wedding day had been replaced entirely by a love more genuine and enduring than she had ever believed possible. He stood beside her at the window, his hand covering hers as they both looked out over the grounds bathed in the soft light of early winter, and neither of them needed words to express what they felt in that quiet moment. The frightened bargain that had once brought them together had long since faded into memory, replaced by a devotion neither had expected to find, built patiently through trust, courage, and the shared pursuit of truth. Whatever the county had once believed about the feared Duke of Ashcombe, Eleanor knew the truth now more completely than anyone, and she carried it with her always, a quiet certainty that the man she loved had never been the monster of rumor, but simply a good man waiting, all along, for someone willing to look past the fear and see him clearly.